The SEAL convoy vanished in seconds. No explosion, no distress call. Just a sudden blackout and a silent road twisting toward the mountains. Someone had taken them, and they were already accelerating out of reach, except for one pilot who refused to let them disappear. You're watching Warthog Valor stories, where forgotten missions, hidden heroes, and impossible recoveries take flight. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Major Talia Reeves was 40 minutes into a routine patrol when the alert flashed across her secondary display. At first, it didn't make sense, a convoy vanishing on a clear day, on a route that had been scanned a dozen times. But the second message made her stomach tighten. Personnel, SEAL Detachment Bravo. This wasn't cargo. These were operators trained for the worst scenarios imaginable, and even they hadn't managed to send a distress code. Talia pushed the throttle, banking the A-10 toward the ridgeline. The Hog responded with its familiar rumble, the engines settling into the controlled growl she trusted more than any digital system. She didn't need radar or satellite cues yet. She knew the terrain, knew the roads the convoy had to follow, and knew exactly how fast an armored column could disappear if someone planned it right. As she crossed the first ridge, the route below came into full view. Dust trails should have been there. Heavy vehicles always left something behind, but the entire stretch looked wiped clean. No debris, no tracks, no heat signatures. Just a faint disturbance deeper along the canyon, as if something large had moved through recently and deliberately. She followed the faint line until it broke into a wide basin where the convoy should have regrouped. Instead, she found a set of burned tire marks twisting sharply toward a side road that wasn't on any official map. Someone had forced them off route. Someone who knew the timing, the procedure, and exactly when the escort drone rotation would leave a gap. Talia switched to low-altitude run, letting the Hog skim the basin floor. The wind kicked dust up around the canopy, but she stayed steady. Her analog receiver crackled faintly, not with a distress call, but with an encrypted pulse, a signal bouncing between moving vehicles ahead of her. Whoever had taken the SEALs wasn't hiding. They were communicating. She climbed slightly, catching the first glimpse of a distant dust plume curling along the valley's far exit. It wasn't natural wind. It was acceleration, fast, coordinated, and controlled. If that plume belonged to the convoy, then they were being driven toward a route meant to seal them off from the sky. And as Talia aligned her trajectory for pursuit, her receiver picked up a second signal, a deliberate jam pulse aimed directly at her A-10.
Talia pushed the Hog lower, letting the wing skim the warm-up drafts rising from the basin floor. The jamming pulse trailing her wasn't strong enough to break her comms yet, but it was steady, a clear sign that whoever hijacked the convoy expected someone to come after them. That meant they were organized, equipped, and confident enough to challenge an A-10. Not many groups in the world tried that, and even fewer survived it. She leveled out as the terrain narrowed into a long, slanted chute carved by decades of wind. The dust plume ahead sharpened into a defined trail, curling left and right in tight arcs. The convoy wasn't moving in a straight line. They were being herded through a route designed to keep them low and out of air support sight lines. This wasn't a simple escape. It was a planned extraction. Her analog receiver chirped again, this time picking up faint metallic echoes across the rocks. Not vehicles, not gunfire, machinery. She saw the first blockade a moment later. 2 armored pickup trucks were parked sideways across the canyon floor, forming a crude wall. Men moved behind them, silhouettes with long rifles and something bulkier slung across their backs. Not random militia. Their gear matched, their movement patterns matched, and they weren't fleeing. They were waiting. Talia narrowed her eyes and pulled higher for a better angle. The Hog's sensors flickered but stayed responsive. The jamming signal wasn't meant to shut her down completely. It was meant to shorten her reaction window, to distort just enough data that a rushed pilot would overshoot the canyon and lose the convoy for good. Not her. She dipped into a descending run, lining up the blockade. The men scattered behind the trucks, diving for cover the moment they recognized the shape overhead. The Hog's shadow swallowed the canyon. Talia held fire, not out of hesitation, but calculation. If she struck too early, the hijackers would trigger whatever second phase they had planned. She needed the convoy intact, not buried under panicked fire. Then she saw it, a third vehicle behind the blockade, an armored transport with markings hastily sprayed over. The rear hatch was closed, but its suspension sagged, meaning people were inside. SEALs were still alive. She had to break the blockade without risking that transport. Talia swapped to a shallow angle, targeting the canyon wall beside the trucks instead of the vehicles themselves. One burst from the GAU-8 cracked a section of rock loose, sending sheets of stone collapsing onto the trucks and forcing the hijackers backward. Dust spiraled upward. The makeshift wall buckled just enough to create a gap. She pushed through the canyon, skimming the debris cloud until the trail opened again. The dust plume ahead reappeared, the transport still moving, still pushing hard toward the ridge network. But something else shifted in her headset. A new pulse, stronger, directional, and not aimed at her.
It was aimed at the convoy. Someone ahead wasn't trying to escape with the SEALs. They were trying to hand them off to a second, far more dangerous unit. And as Talia accelerated, a shadow moved along the ridge above her, the unmistakable silhouette of a heavy anti-air launcher locking its turret toward the sky. Talia dropped even lower, letting the canyon walls rush past the canopy as she pushed toward the rising ridge. The dust trail from the convoy's transport was clearer now. Sharper turns, harder acceleration, more desperate corrections. They weren't just running, they were being driven. And the stronger jamming pulse she'd detected was guiding them toward a point where air support couldn't follow without taking fire. She scanned the ridge quickly. The shadow she'd seen earlier resolved into a tall, angular launcher mounted on a reinforced tripod. Not a man-portable tube, something heavier, the kind used to deny entire corridors of airspace. The turret motor whined as it tracked, trying to lock onto her as she weaved through the narrowing canyon. If she climbed too soon, she'd take a missile through the belly. If she stayed low, she'd lose sight of the convoy completely. She chose a third option, cut wide. The Hog slipped out of the canyon mouth and into a low, fast arc along the outer ridge. Dust kicked into a rolling wake behind her. The launcher pivoted, unable to follow quickly enough. A second later, it made its mistake, firing too early, the missile streaking past her tail and detonating against the far slope in a plume of shattered stone. The shockwave rattled the canopy, but she held firm. Now she had the angle she needed. Below, the convoy's transport burst into a wider basin, forced toward a natural choke point between two boulders. 3 more hostile vehicles waited there, one blocking the exit, 2 positioned for a handoff. The hijackers weren't trying to hide their destination anymore. They had reached it. Talia throttled forward. The Hog roared across the basin floor, and the first hostile gunners panicked, spraying fire upward that fell hopelessly short. She lined her shot not on the transport, but on the ground beside the blocking vehicle. A tight burst of GAAU rounds ripped the dirt apart, sending a wall of dust and debris slamming into the attackers. The blocking truck fishtailed sideways, clearing a path. The hijackers scrambled to reform their formation, shouting directions she couldn't hear but could easily interpret. They were minutes, maybe seconds, from transferring the SEALs into a heavier reinforced vehicle waiting deeper in the ridge network. She dipped the Hog lower to force their heads down, then pulled up sharply to avoid overshooting the basin. The convoy's transport seized the moment, its driver ramming the throttle and bursting through the half-broken blockade. It didn't matter. The hijackers weren't shaken. They simply shifted to their next phase.
The stronger, jamming pulse returned, clearer now, almost rhythmic. A signal. A summon. Someone deeper in the ridge was powering up something big. Whoever orchestrated this wasn't just extracting a SEAL team. They were preparing a trap designed specifically for whatever aircraft tried to intervene. And as Talia cleared the far ridge, a massive armored vehicle rolled into view, its roof mounting a rotating turret built to knock an A-10 out of the sky. The armored vehicle emerging from the pass was bigger than anything Talia expected this group to field. Heavy plating, reinforced suspension, and a turret bolted onto its roof that looked more at home on a forward operating base than on a moving convoy. The barrel assembly rotated with mechanical confidence, already tracking upward toward her flight path. This wasn't scavenged gear. This was intentional, supplied, planned. Talia pulled the hog into a quick lateral brake, letting the turret's first burst tear through empty sky. Blue-white tracer lines snapped past her canopy, slicing the air where she had been 2 seconds earlier. The weapon wasn't dumb. It recalibrated rapidly, shifting angles with alarming precision. A direct climb would get her hit. A straight dive would trap her in its firing cone. So she stayed unpredictable. She skimmed the ridge, letting the hog's left wingtip almost brush the rock before banking sharply into a shallow dive on the turret's blind side. The armored vehicle lurched to reposition, its drivers fighting to swing the heavy platform around. They couldn't match her speed, but they didn't have to. They only needed to keep her occupied long enough for the transport team to get the SEALs into the deeper passage beyond the pass. If that happened, she'd lose them in a maze of split routes no aircraft could safely enter. Talia angled downward, measuring her window. Firing directly at the turret's barrel risked sending shrapnel into the transport carrying the hostages. She needed a disabling strike, not a destructive one. Her eyes traced the turret's mounting bracket, heavy bolts, tension rods, and a stabilizer plate near the rear axle. That would do. She squeezed the trigger. A short, disciplined burst. The GAE-U-8's round slammed into the stabilizer plate, shredding the reinforcement and kicking the entire turret assembly off balance. The next rotation nearly tore it off its own mount. As the vehicle tried correcting, the damaged turret twisted sideways and jammed completely. The crew panicked. They bailed out, scattering behind rocks. The vehicle itself veered and rolled to a hard stop against the ridge wall, smoke rising from its crippled pivot system. But Talia didn't celebrate. The transport carrying the SEALs had already pushed deeper into the path, accelerating toward the network of winding paths beyond. And she saw something worse. 2 escort vehicles had broken formation and were heading upward along a higher ledge. They weren't escaping. They were climbing to create a second kill box above her. She throttled forward, hugging the canyon floor to stay beneath their firing arcs. But her receiver caught another pulse, sharper, cleaner, more deliberate than the previous ones. A beacon, a timing code, a countdown aimed at the heart of the ridge. The hijackers weren't just transferring hostages. They were synchronizing a strike meant to collapse the entire pass if she followed too far. And as she banked for pursuit, the first demolition charge detonated somewhere ahead, kicking a cloud of stone into the air large enough to bury a convoy alive. The blast tore through the ridge with a violence that felt almost deliberate. A shockwave hammered the hog's fuselage, rattling the canopy, while a thick plume of dust surged upward like a volcanic column. Talia steadied her grip and pulled higher, skimming the expanding cloud as boulders the size of vehicle hoods tumbled down the slope. This wasn't an accidental landslide. This was engineered collapse, placed with precision, timed to the second, and triggered specifically to bury the SEAL transport deeper inside the path. Through the swirling haze, the transport reappeared for a heartbeat. It swerved hard to the right, metal scraping rock as its driver fought to keep the vehicle upright while debris hammered the path behind it. The chute it was trapped in barely measured one vehicle width across. There was no shoulder, no alternative lane, no room to maneuver. If another charge went off, the route would seal like a tomb. Talia dropped back to canyon level, staying just above the dust so she could track the convoy's trajectory. The jamming pulses she had been monitoring since the first blockade were no longer random noise. Now she could read the spacing between them, the cadence, the deliberate drop-off after each peak. The pulses weren't meant to disrupt her flight systems anymore. They were counting down to the next demolition. Whoever controlled them had turned the entire path into a timed escape corridor. Another pulse struck her receiver. Strong, clean, 5 seconds until ignition. Talia didn't hesitate. She rolled the hog into a fast, aggressive dive, letting the aircraft drop along the inner curve of the ridge wall. Dust exploded outward beneath her as she locked onto the next charge site, a cluster of metallic tubes anchored into a fracture in the rock, surrounded by hostile fighters prepping for the next detonation. They hadn't expected her to follow this low, this fast, or this precisely. The hog roared into view. They looked up, far too late. Talia fired a controlled burst into the rock above them. The GAU-8 rounds shattered the cliff face, sending a cascade of shattered stone directly onto the detonator crew. The wires ripped free, sparks flashed, and the synchronized blast fizzled out before it could trigger. The second collapse never happened. But new problems rose instantly.
The convoy transport didn't slow down. It didn't try to turn back. It was being forced deeper into the ridge network by a larger armored vehicle in front of it, a heavy truck with reinforced front panels and a box-like cargo shield on its rear. That vehicle wasn't fleeing. It was leading. The SEALs weren't being taken at random. They were being guided toward a second team deeper in the pass, a full-scale extraction handoff. Talia climbed slightly to regain sight lines and instantly saw danger on both sides. 2 hostile escort trucks had broken formation and crawled up onto the higher ledges, using narrow goat trails carved into the rock. Fighters leaned out of their beds with long tubes resting on their shoulders, not rifles, launchers. Their elevated angle gave them perfect visibility on both her and the transport. If they hit the transport, it was over. If they hit her, the convoy would be left alone and doomed. She angled left, then right, weaving through the limited airspace to confuse their targeting. The first launcher team fired too early, sending a smoke trail screaming past her tail before detonating harmlessly against a column of jagged stone. Talia banked hard, lined up her shot, and fired a tight burst. The rounds cracked a ledge beneath the first team, sending fighters scrambling as rock crumbled away. But the second team wasn't firing at her. They were aiming at the transport. Talia's blood ran cold as she saw the rocket streak downward, not wobbling, not drifting, not confused by heat signatures. This was no heat seeker, no dumb rocket. It flew with eerie precision, adjusting mid-air. A laser-guided shot, meaning someone deeper in the pass, completely hidden from view, was painting the transport with an invisible beam. If the laser designator wasn't taken out immediately, the next rocket wouldn't miss, and the SEAL's transport would be turned into scrap before they ever reached the handoff point. And as Talia dove to intercept, she finally saw it. A thin, steady green reflection on the transport side panel. The laser marking that meant the next warhead was already on the way. The thin green glint on the transport side panel was enough to turn Talia's pulse into a hard, steady drumbeat. A laser designator, precise, steady,
and controlled by someone who knew exactly how to kill an armored vehicle with one well-placed warhead. The hijackers weren't panicking. They were executing a plan. The rocket chasing the transport corrected mid-air, adjusting perfectly along the painted line. Talia shoved the hog downward, wings cutting through the narrow chute as the pass curved beneath her. She scanned the rock walls fast. The laser wasn't fired from the ridge above. The angle was too low. It had to be deeper in the pass, tucked behind one of the stone outcroppings.
A small shimmer gave it away, a reflection bouncing off a flat rock surface. Then the faint silhouette of a man leaning behind cover. Talia rolled the hog sideways, threading through a space barely wider than her wings. She lined her burst not on the sniper, but on the rock face shielding him. The GAU-8 tore the outcrop apart in a violent spray of dust and stone. The green dot vanished instantly. The rocket lost guidance and spiraled out, detonating harmlessly against the far wall. The SEAL's transport lurched forward, still boxed in, but no longer seconds from obliteration. The lead armored truck, dragging them deeper into the ridge, accelerated again. They weren't fleeing, they were delivering their captives. Talia regained altitude and finally saw the full layout ahead. The pass didn't open into a wide network. Instead, it funneled into a bowl-shaped basin, hemmed in by sheer granite walls. A dead end, a containment point, a handoff zone. The armored truck braked sharply at the center. A dozen figures jumped out, all moving with coordinated precision, too clean, too controlled to be untrained fighters. They surrounded the SEAL's transport with cold efficiency, shouting orders and forming a perimeter. If they breached those doors, the operators inside would be separated and vanished underground within minutes. Talia dipped back into a low attack run. Bullets rattled against the hog's armored belly as the hijackers fired upward, but their angles were terrible. The basin trapped their own fire almost as much as it trapped the convoy. She lined her shot on the blocking vehicle, cutting off the SEAL's transport escape route. A tight burst destroyed its front axle, flipping it onto its side and scattering the fighters around it. The circle broke apart instantly. The SEAL driver slammed the throttle, trying to reverse out of the trap. But Talia's receiver chimed again, a new pulse, stronger and cleaner than any she'd heard so far. This wasn't jamming. This wasn't a signal. It was activation. Something under the basin was powering up. This wasn't just an extraction zone. It was a kill zone designed for aircraft. And as Talia banked upward for a second strike, the ground inside the basin split open, revealing the rising frame of a hidden launch platform aimed directly at her A-10.